Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimberly Chalia with PHCA. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, IT Risks, presented by Javier Young. A few quick updates to share before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the PHCA website. The webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit for all attendees. For those who provided a NAB number, credits will be uploaded shortly and we'll also share certificates with those in attendance. As we begin today, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. Please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A icon on your screen, and we'll make sure to answer as many of those questions as possible at the end of today's presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Javier.
All right, hope everybody is doing well. Happy Tuesday, December 13th. My name is Javier Young. Going to be talking to you today about case studies in cybersecurity. So we have a lot to cover today, and we'll have some questions at the end. If you have any pressing questions, need clarity ASAP, don't hesitate to chime in and I'll answer those in real time. We will get right into it. All right, so case studies in cybersecurity. Disclaimer just up front, this is not legal advice. Just want to make that be known. I'll leave this up for a few seconds, but ultimately, that's what this slide is saying here. So for our learning objectives today, we have a few things that we're going to discuss. We want to get an understanding of the latest current threat landscape. So threat developments, what's going on, especially in the healthcare industry, general themes and things to look out for. We want to learn where we can, focus our valuable resources in the name of risk mitigation techniques. We also want to recognize the critical dependencies as well as, outsourced service provider relationship risk from a external consultant standpoint, as well as, external technology or technology hosted externally for our organization. And lastly, we want to go over a framework to be able to plan for future security efforts. So a little bit about CLA. We are a professional services firm, a little over 7,500, approaching 8,000 employees, kind of nationwide, over 121 US locations. We are also global as of recently, so we do have some operations globally. And we want to get to know you, learn you, and assist you in any way that we can. All right, so a little bit about me. Again, I'm Javier Young. I've been with CLA for a little over 3 years, but I have about 15 years experience in just the field of cybersecurity. And my experience ranges from a few different kind of subjects, incident response, penetration testing, insider threat. I also have some cyber analytics, so use case development, logging and alerting to ensure that we are detecting the fraud that is currently out there and we are properly responding to that fraud and mitigating the risk as well. Also evaluation of IT controls and compliance at organizations. Independent of that, love family, love barbecue, and I do it year round. So, love to be out there. You see some dice up in the upper right hand picture here. So, legacy, everybody in the security field generally has a nickname. Mine at one point was Snake Eyes. Just a little fun fact there. And then, somewhat applicable, I put this picture of me. This is me in Russia outside of Red Square. So, I just generally like to put that in there as a Easter egg, so to speak. So with that, we will jump right into it. Family right there as well. So, all right. So the background and kind of the current, landscape, things to look out for, things that we see in industry. So common cyber attacks that we see that's just kind of the, the old gold, what's still lucrative is that phishing. These are in various forms. So the most prevalent that we see is going to be email phishing. I know as organizations mature, We often test our employees internally to kind of keep them on their toes, but user education is what we are testing for here. So common attacks, email phishing. We have voice phishing, people trying to pick up the phone and call you. They're either spoofing somebody you work with, or they're impersonating a service provider, an IT contact, and they're trying to get you to give up sensitive information or any type of information that's going to help further their attack. We also see spear phishing, so people that are targeted that are kind of high value at organizations, your C-suite, CFO, CEO. A lot of people like to impersonate those individuals to send either an email or pick up the phone and try to call or a lower level or junior staff to get them to do something for that CEO or CFO that they are spoofing. And then this is one of the reasons this is so common is because it is wildly successful. So attackers gain a lot of intelligence, sometimes whether they're successful or not. The ultimate goal is to gain access, move money, learn about the organization to further attacks. So one of the things to look out for are kind of those links that you see that just look abnormal. They look malicious. They look sketchy. So don't give up your login credentials. Another thing from a phishing standpoint that attackers try to do is they will try to implant malicious software on your device should you interact with that phishing email in any capacity. And by downloading that malicious software, oftentimes it allows a remote connection between your device and that malicious attacker's device. And once that happens, it's oftentimes game over. There's also called a distributed denial of service attack. So this is really overwhelming your resources externally. So your externally facing infrastructure, VPN, if you're hosting any type of transactional website, patient login type stuff, really just, productivity loss here when it comes to that denial of service because it overwhelms the website and eventually that website will either be degraded or completely crash or go down. But ultimately, that phishing and in some instances with the DDoS shorthand for distributed denial of service that often leads to ransomware attacks or a data breach. And I'll discuss, the breach up front before we get into ransomware. So with data breaches, of course, lost stolen devices is something to look out for. Insider threats as well. But ultimately, if any type of data loss, data compromise, access to EPHI, PII, PFI, which is personal financial information. So think account numbers, credit cards. Those are considered, compromises of data and in instances of data breach, especially if attackers are able to exfiltrate that data, which is often the common goal. Which we get into ransomware attacks. So this is the most prevalent, it's the most lucrative over the past few years. Everybody kind of knows to a degree what ransomware really is, but we're going to talk about it a little deeper here. But ultimately, attackers get in, they will encrypt the data at your organization, rendering it useless to you and unusable. And then they will ask for a ransom for you for them to be able to decrypt that data so you can get back up to speed. So the potential effects of any of these attacks are multiple things. So reputational loss, very bad if something happens to your organization. It is public, and you're in the news. So definitely want to avoid that. There's also financial loss as well as legal and regulatory sanctions in certain instances depending on the type of data that was either exposed, breached, or compromised. So we get into ransomware specifically in healthcare. So this information was taken from Sophos. They usually have an annual report kind of mid-year. So this came from the 2021 report, which was about May, June of 2021. And it just has some statistics on the state of ransomware in healthcare. And I know this is outdated data, but I do want to show you kind of the importance of this data versus 2022. So, they did some surveys and they have some actual data. So 34% of healthcare organizations surveyed here were hit by ransomware in the previous year. 41% of the organizations said that they were not hit by ransomware, but they expected or anticipated being hit with ransomware in the future. And then you have 24%, not hit by ransomware in the last year, and then they also do not expect to be hit in the future. So one thing of note here is that these numbers are pretty high, and they're only going to get higher. So if we run to kind of the next slide, ransomware in healthcare kind of breaks it down further. So, I mentioned that 34% of healthcare organizations hit by ransomware. 65% of those that were hit by ransomware said that the criminals were able to successfully encrypt their data. 44% of those organizations where the data was encrypted, they were able to use backups to restore that data. So, not necessarily having to pay the ransom to get their data back. 34% of those that data was encrypted, they paid the ransom to get the data back. However, excuse me. However, 69% of the encrypted data, only 69% of the encrypted data was restored after that ransom was paid. And then, through the survey, it said that 89% of healthcare orgs, they do have some type of incident recovery plan. So again, this was, this came out in mid 2021. In the middle of 2022, Sophos released another report, and ransomware attacks year over year for healthcare organizations rose 94%. So, where we have this 34%, hit by ransomware in the 21 report, in 22, it was reported that 66% of healthcare organizations surveyed said they experienced a ransomware attack. So year over year, we have seen, especially in healthcare, ransomware is kind of the number one thing that organizations are trying to mitigate and prepare themselves for. Um, Healthcare is also the number one industry of targeted attacks, and it has become the most lucrative from a financial standpoint at this point for malicious attackers. From the latest report, 61% of healthcare organizations suffered ransomware. They did indeed pay that ransom, again, making that the highest sector of, you know, across the land to be in that situation where paying the ransom or being targeted. Also of note, only 78% of the healthcare organizations surveyed said that they had cyber insurance. So wanted to make that, known as well. So ransomware. you know, again, just want to hammer this home because it's very important. Some of the names you see out here, CryptoLocker, Locky, WannaCry, the goal is to encrypt all data, hold it for ransom for payment. It also, there's kind of this, play Mythbusters here. They can impact non-Windows systems. So a lot of people in industry or at organizations say, well, we are using Apple products or Linux products. Ransomware really doesn't care at this point, and all of those are susceptible to being compromised. So legacy, when ransomware kind of first came out and was known, attackers would come in, encrypt the data, say, please pay the ransom, we'll release it. And then, the payments were pretty small at that point. And then, mileage varied on whether they would receive payment or not. Now, what malicious attackers are doing is they're coming into the organization, they're staying in there for a while, they're learning about everything. They are exfiltrating the data, so they're removing the data from the organization. Then they're encrypting the data, and then they're saying, hey, pay this ransom, and we will decrypt the data so you can return back to normal. And by the way, if you don't pay the ransom, since we already have the data, we're going to leak it to the public anyway. So you're in somewhat of a catch-22 situation there. Um, so, just want to make that, kind of known as that that's the way of the world now. Also, when ransomware first came out, it was more so proof of concept, lower level malicious attackers were using it. Payouts were um, relatively low. You're talking hundreds to thousands of dollars. Now, on average, we are well into the millions on kind of what's being requested from malicious attackers now. WannaCry specifically um, was very rampant. It spread like wildfire to many organizations globally. It was about 150 countries and affected, 100 to 200,000 computers. So that was a pretty big compromise from a ransomware perspective. All right. Again, ransomware get into those business networks. How does this happen? Email phishing, so opening attachments, downloading payloads. A lot of what we see, especially in healthcare organizations, are unpatched systems or systems that are running end of support or end of life software. Healthcare industry is kind of limited, and especially when it comes to certain devices that can't be upgraded because there are legacy applications deemed necessary to continue operations. However, this presents a very large risk to the organization because a lot of these systems that are end of support by the vendor are not receiving the latest security patches. And when that is happening, um, of course, you have unsecured devices. And they're generally exploits that people can just, perform a web search for. They can download it locally and just point it at a compromised machine or a machine that, is not up to date. And without much knowledge, they can run it and generally gain access to that system from some type of administrative level or escalate privileges there. So unpatched systems or end of life, end of support systems as much as possible, ensure that they do not exist on your network. Have a solid plan to decommission or sunset those systems and run with the most current versions of software that you can. Internet accessible login prompts. So, when COVID happened, a lot of people had to go home. We had to kind of ramp up what that looked like architecturally. So, VPNs, Outlook Web Access, so OWA, Citrix gateways, remote desktop, anything externally facing that has an internet prompt that is visible to the outside world. Those should be protected with multi-factor authentication if they need to be exposed externally. Going back to that, 78% of healthcare organizations said that they did have a cyber insurance policy. What we see now is that premiums are often kind of tripling or quadrupling from what many organizations are saying. And cyber insurance companies are now requiring organizations to have certain controls in place. One of those things, multi-factor authentication, especially externally for all of those authentication prompts. In addition to those authentication prompts, one of the hardest things to adopt are strong, long passwords. So, what we generally recommend 14 characters plus for regular domain users. And what we see is that this prevents people from guessing your passwords at organization or run brute force attacks. We are lazy as people, and when we have multiple passwords, our password selection is also generally lazy. So things like password one. When it's time for me to change it, I'm just going to change it to password two. Um, Attackers know this and they go after that low hanging fruit when it comes to passwords. Season and year. So, spring 22, fall 2022, winter 22. These are all very prevalent at many organizations, and attackers know that as well. What we preach is long passwords, but really passphrases. So things that can't be looked up in the dictionary, keyboard walks, all numbers, all letters. Those are things we want to avoid, and we want to go to kind of creating sentences and then changing out characters for special characters That way it becomes harder for attackers to guess, but it also becomes harder for systems and password crackers to actually crack those passwords as well. And then once you get to that kind of lengthy password, you can relax the frequency in which you rotate those passwords. I know oftentimes many organizations choose 90 days to change passwords. But there's generally no reason to do that if you have strong, lengthy, and complex passwords, unless you suspect that there's a compromise. That would be the only reason that you should change it if you meet those requirements. So ransomware in the news over the past few years. Two kind of major things that I often point at is we have JBS Foods. So that shut down operations at a lot of beef plants for several days. Huge disruption in the supply chain from kind of the food network economy. JBS ended up paying an $11 million ransom to get back up. What that number doesn't take into account is a production loss, labor that goes along with that, and then the cost it takes to get back to normal, and the cost it takes to ensure that that type of attack vector is closed, shut down, and doesn't happen again. Colonial Pipeline also, shut down operations for several days. It caused kind of mass panic of consumers buying gas. If you were on the internet looking at social media, this is that scenario where people were filling up kind of trash bags and plastic bags of gas because they just were panic buying. And interesting to look at. However, real issue in the economy. Colonial Pipeline ended up paying $4.5 million in ransom to come out of that. Again, doesn't take into account getting back up to speed, updating systems, reputational loss as well. So again, these were about 2 years ago. Since then, ransoms are getting larger and larger across the globe. So how do we mitigate from ransomware in general? What should we be doing at our organizations? So one of the things you should do is you should know what you have. Risk assess, classify, and inventory your systems. You want to know the software that you have. You want to have an approved software list. Hardware, you want to know what hardware you have, where it's located, and who can interact with that. Consistently audit all of your networks, internally, externally. We want to see penetration testing from the external standpoint. So what could a malicious attacker do given limited information about your organization? What's out there? What can they find out about you on the open web? We call that open source intelligence. Can we identify your C-suite? Can we identify email addresses, phone numbers, who you interact with from a business standpoint? Internally, we want to see that inside in. Somebody also acting as a malicious attacker to see what may be vulnerable on the inside and how privileges can be escalated. We want that proactive penetration testing because, better it be someone that you hire to do that versus an actual attacker. Don't want to be surprised, don't want to be hit with the element of surprise, because when that happens, it causes panic at many organizations. You want to review and assess risk related to privileged user accounts. So going back to that administrator access, we want to audit those privileges. We want to ensure that users are current, authorized, have the correct access rights. If you are an organization that has users that may be able to transition jobs, so they switch job roles within the company, ensuring that things like privilege creep does not exist. So I'm in this new role, but I'm carrying permissions or access to systems from a previous role still. Do I still need that? So we should often do that type of kind of auditing and monitoring from a privileged user access. Do I have excessive access to my local workstation, excuse me? Am I allowed to download things from the internet and install software from an unapproved standpoint? Is that technically allowed? Network technology, so your routers, your printers, ensuring you're not using default out-of-the-box passwords. Oftentimes what we'll see is that when newer technology is implemented in the network, those default passwords are not changed. And then you can perform a web search and say, hey, here's the product, here's the model number, and usually there is a site that's going to give you the default username and password. And if that is externally facing, meaning exposed to the internet, anybody can just Google that information and probably log right in if default passwords are there. So, logging, alerting, always need that, very critical to the organization. We want to do all this to know what normal looks like so we can be able to quickly identify what is abnormal. Training and testing employees. So I know we all hate those phishing emails if we're at organizations that send those. However, having savvy users is paramount to the success of your organization from a security standpoint. Oftentimes they're the first line of defense. Oftentimes users are the last line of defense. So you want to make sure that they are, for lack of a better phrase, slightly paranoid in some of the communications that they're receiving. Are we expecting to receive certain type of communication? Do we normally get these types of communications from these type of people? So we want to train and test employees to ensure that they are always up to par and kind of on their toes. And last, from this standpoint, is develop a cyber resilience plan and test that frequently. So we want to test simulations. So let's simulate an actual attack. Who needs to be notified? What step 1 through step, whatever. Plan, test the plan, and modify accordingly. So again, back to user education and phishing, mentioned this on the last slide. Malware typically needs some type of helper to do its job, and user enticement is where we still are in that 85 to 95% range of most significant breaches or attacks at organizations or through some type of facilitation of user involvement. So testing those employees, frequently is going to be great. Common phishing scenarios, as well as how to identify masked links, spoofed sender addresses. So oftentimes what organizations will see is that when they receive these phishing emails, some people will drop off a letter from the domain, and to the naked eye, we don't really see that, or we'll switch certain things, in an email address to make it look more legitimate. So we have to be really good at identifying those links, not clicking on links, especially links that we don't expect. All right, so strong user control. So again, when we do penetration testing on clients, we can often do a configuration audit. And we often notice that a lot of times staff has administrative rights local to their workstation. And what this allows them to do is to be able to perform actions of an administrator. So things like installing software, changing their own password to kind of circumvent policy in some instances, not all instances, but the opportunity is there. If that user account is compromised by a legitimate attacker, that attacker now has local administrative rights to that workstation, and it becomes easier to escalate those privileges to be able to laterally move around the network. And it just becomes easier to potentially escalate their privileges to that of what's called a domain user. A domain user is allowed to do anything on the network. So of course we want to know who those domain administrators are and ensure that nobody else is escalating privileges or creating accounts on the fly. So email, browsing, or general computer use with admin credentials is kind of a big no-no. Definitely don't want to see that happening from your administrators. Again, multi-factor authentication is what we want to see. If you have a user that is also administrator, we want to see unique sets of credentials for that. So one account should not have those domain admin privileges. We would expect to see that that person logs out of their regular user account and then goes to that workstation, that device, or what have you with their unique domain administrator privileges. Again, administrators should not log into workstations with domain admin rights. The reason for that is that there are records of login, and what an attacker could do is they could just dump the local password hashes of people that have logged into, a workstation or a laptop, and oftentimes those domain administrator credentials will be in that bucket, and sometimes they are stored in clear text depending on your organization. So also protecting your organization from ransomware or any type of significant incident is we want to see sound data backup procedures. Ensuring that you are backing up your critical data, your critical applications. Again, attackers are getting smarter and they are deleting or encrypting your offline backups, your online backups. So ensuring that you are backing up in multiple places, offline, cloud, tape, meet, what have you. We want to see multiple backups of the same data, and that you are actually testing your data backups to be able to restore should an incident occur. Perform thorough review of permissions for those network file shares, see who has access to those data backups. Because if you have sound data backups, if you are hit by ransomware, oftentimes you can just recover from the data backups that you have without paying the ransom. But again, this takes, somewhat of a heavy lift and a lot of communication and testing of that data backup as well. I did have a client that was hit by ransomware. They had data backups, however, they had never tested the restoration of the data backups. So when it came time to restore from that data, it was a very challenging task for them. So, again, frequently test samples of data backups and recovery. All right. So now we get into our first case study, Microsoft Exchange. So almost every organization at some point has used Microsoft Exchange. A lot of organizations are switching over to Office 365 now, just called M365, Microsoft 365. But Microsoft Exchange, very prevalent for many years, still is in many instances. So specifically, Microsoft Exchange instances that were hosted on site, on corporate servers, you know, these were targeted because often these Exchange servers have privileged access throughout the network. With Exchange Online, it's usually hosted by Microsoft's cloud, and organizations don't have to manage that server any longer, only the application, which is why a lot of you know organizations are transitioning to that cloud type service. So why is Microsoft Exchange a target? The why of that is because it's often a central hub for many organizations. It is a treasure trove of information. So attackers can kind of understand who talks to who within an organization or external to an organization. Oftentimes conversations, chat messages can be pulled from Exchange as well. Files, so things that are sent as attachments, what types of files, um, how large, what are the sign-offs, what are the protections, if any, and then authorization. So, who is authorized to do what in the organization can often be found out should somebody gain access to kind of Exchange feeds or data. And we're going to talk about one, particular vulnerability that happened with Exchange in 2021. But over the past few years, there have been kind of some pretty recent exploitation of Microsoft Exchange in general. So we have Priv Exchange, which occurred in 2019. We have Static View State, which was 2020. But today, what we're going to focus on is this 2021 exploitation, this vulnerability is called proxy logon. and it was performed by a group called Hafnium. But hey, I want to take you through the timeline of what happened, and kind of why this is critical to understand. So according to Microsoft, um, Hafnium is a hacking group based out of China, and their aim is to target US companies by using virtual private servers in the United States. So what Hafnium did was they were able to manipulate some of the functionality in Microsoft Exchange to be able to gain what's called remote code execution to compromise those servers. So if we look at the timeline of events, starting in January of 21, so on January 5th, you have a lot of security researchers out in the industry. They are often looking at vulnerabilities to be able to, shore up or communicate to organizations like Microsoft that something needs to be fixed or we see something kind of crazy here. So the security firm DevCore tells Microsoft that, hey, we recognize this vulnerability in Exchange. A day later, there's another security firm that says, hey, Microsoft, we see some hackers actively exploiting Exchange, and we see this activity going back to January 3rd. On January 8th, Microsoft confirms the vulnerability. So, we see this activity as early as January 3rd. On January 8th, Microsoft says, hey, we see the vulnerability. On January 27th, so a few weeks later, another security firm notifies Microsoft that they noticed many organizations being hacked by this unknown Exchange vulnerability. So almost a month and a half later, in February 18th, from kind of the initial activity that we see, Microsoft then notifies a security firm that there will be patches released on March's Patch Tuesday. And what Patch Tuesday is on certain Tuesdays out of the month, Microsoft will issue patches and updates for their products. So, Microsoft says that they're going to release this in February. So notice that this Exchange vulnerability has probably been known prior to January. However, we see it being actively exploited starting in the middle of January. A month and a half later, in the middle of February, Microsoft says, all right, we're going to have a patch, but that patch is going to be available March 9th. So when that is announced on March 26th, February 26th, mass exploitation of the Exchange vulnerability is seen from around the world. So again, we're approaching 2 months of this vulnerability that is not fixed, being exploited around the globe. So after February 26 happens, Microsoft on March 2nd releases the patch a week early, the patches for that. On March 5th, it's reported, we are pretty much 2 months out from January at this point. It says that 30,000 organizations in the US were exploited, in addition to hundreds of thousands more worldwide just from this vulnerability alone. And then on March 9th, Microsoft says that 100,000 of the 400,000 Exchange servers globally remained unpatched. So from a vulnerability to mitigation standpoint, this took about 2 months for a fix to be implemented or available for organizations to implement. So again, it's about that due diligence of knowing what you have. If you had this version of Exchange, recognizing that you do have it, and then what kind of risk mitigation techniques do you have to ensure that you aren't being actively compromised for that. So for the Hafnium vulnerabilities, so this CVE number, these are called common vulnerability and exposure numbers. So when we have known exploits in industry, they're often researched and then assigned a CVE number, and you can go to the MITRE website, which kind of operates CVE, and you can get a rundown of what that vulnerability is and if there are any types of potential fixes for that as well. So what can we do about something like this? The mitigating control specific to this. So ensure we have sound logging and monitoring, egress filtering. So things going external to the organization, do we have some type of insight as to what's leaving our organization? Antivirus and endpoint controls is something that we always want to see. And again, multi-factor authentication specifically for email and remote connections within organizations. So we move on to SolarWinds, another case study here. Um, SolarWinds was also very huge. So what SolarWinds is, it is a system management tool for network and infrastructure monitoring. So this is kind of a management oversight for all the products in your environment. So all your products kind of talk to SolarWinds, and SolarWinds can say, hey, I know some performance issues with this particular device or application. This particular device, we see it doing this. So we want to, log and alert you of that. But again, going back to the timeline here. So, bit of an eye chart here, but September of 2019, malicious attackers start to access SolarWinds. And what they start doing is they start to inject test code here just to see kind of what happens. So, a couple of months later, November 4th, they stop injecting the test code. So, don't really see much activity until February 20th. And in February 20th, there is a backdoor that is compiled and deployed with SolarWinds. So backdoor just allows an attacker to kind of come in, quote unquote, through the backdoor to gain kind of direct access to software or applications that they, plant the backdoor in, so to speak. So this timeline, again, according to Microsoft, so March is the estimated start of the distribution of the backdoor. So now, essentially what has happened is that the attackers have put this backdoor into the SolarWinds product proper. So when organizations start, downloading or using the latest version of SolarWinds, it's going to go to all of those organizations, and now the attackers have access to everywhere that SolarWinds product is installed. So in May, so again, this is kind of low and slow. We're well into 2020 now. May is the estimated start date of the actual hands-on keyboard attacks by the malicious attackers. And then in June, attackers remove the malware from the SolarWinds build environment. And then from June until December, we see that this backdoor supply chain attack was disclosed. So well over a year of this SolarWinds attack before the attack was actually disclosed. So this is kind of what it looks like from what I just mentioned. So you have the malicious attacker here in step one, and I hope everybody can kind of see my cursor. So for one, the threat actor is able to manipulate the software update server here. This software update server at any organization that's using this product, which is multiple, when that is downloaded, it goes out to every device that SolarWinds is kind of responsible for on that network. And then from there, it's being reported over to this command and control server that the threat actor is also controlling. So every time that SolarWinds is downloaded at any organization, it's reporting back to that threat actor. And then that threat actor can see all the applications that are hosted, the infrastructure, and the platforms, and it's just an active compromise there. So pretty sophisticated from what the attackers were able to do. They were in for over a year. They were able to find out so much about SolarWinds, the deployment, implementation, how to get it to organizations that use SolarWinds. Um, and they obfuscated the code, and they were able to do some custom kind of hacking there. So it went undetected for over a year. What is speculated is that somewhere at the time, since become more, but at the time 18,000 organizations downloaded this, and then somewhere between 50 and 100 were subject to additional attacks after that, which really led to privilege escalation in many instances. So again, same thing I just mentioned, just in a more readable format um, there. So what, you know, the objectives of the SolarWind compromise is a lot. So espionage, gathering and stealing information, launching points of attacks into other trusted systems. So all of those applications that SolarWinds interacted with, we were able to gain, that we, malicious attackers were able to gain insight as to kind of what's going on there from an organizational standpoint. So keys to the kingdom in this instance here. So our takeaways are, know what normal looks like. Again, this is easy to say. It is somewhat challenging to kind of get through because it does take a heavy lift initially to really baseline normal at your organization, or what should be normal. So any type of communication, DNS logging, alerting, we want to ensure that we have those sound logging and alerting capabilities, and we are aware of things that just don't make sense. So after hours, updates to certain things, or this person never logs in on the weekend, but now we see activity from this person on the weekend. This person logged in Pennsylvania, and then an hour later we see them logging in from California. We call that the Superman effect, or the superhero effect. That can never happen. It's just geographically impossible. So know what normal looks like, detect abnormal. Um, a lot of things that should be done is just overall emphasis on visibility, understanding your network, being able to quickly correlate events together to identify some of those suspicious patterns or behaviors. In-house threat hunting, looking for IOCs, and IOCs stands for indicators of compromise. So again, you want to have those people that are kind of eyes on glass at all times, looking within the logs to see if anything abnormal is going on. Monitoring those privileged accounts, those service accounts, critical files or sensitive information, tracking those changes and ensuring that those are up to par. If you're in the cloud environment, we want some due diligence around that as well. So kind of high level vendor management, supply chain. I went to school to become a software developer and quickly realized that, not for me. Couldn't see myself programming all day, every day, although I do enjoy doing it. But I'm here to tell you that most computer programmers are just kind of lazy, or, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And oftentimes, secure coding techniques are kind of not top of mind. So all software products and bugs have vulnerabilities. For those of us who have iPhones or Android devices, you're probably getting something a few times a month saying, hey, you need to update this software because of this security vulnerability, and we have a fix for that. This happens so often. So going back to those, keeping your systems updated to the latest patches is critical in almost everything we do. Just not at an organizational level, but at a device level, IoTs, printers, smart devices on your network. So some of the key questions, going back to what I've mentioned before, is what users have privileges and how are they given, software applications, who has access to those, and what do we need to do from a due diligence standpoint, especially from a vendor management and selection standpoint. So looking into um, the financial condition of organizations that you're going to be doing business with, especially if they're going to be managing any of your systems externally. Um, SLAs in place, who is responsible for what from a vendor management standpoint, externally as well as internally, and who needs to be notified if should something go wrong. And last, what I'll finish it off here with is one more case study, and this will be pretty quick, and I'll open it up for some questions with the last few minutes here. But Log4j. So Log4j is a data logging tool, and what occurred with Log4j is that this vulnerability actually existed, what we come to know now, as back as 2012, however, wasn't exploited or identified until 2021. Um, so with Log4j, it was able to exploit kind of many things from a Java standpoint. And with Java, especially those in the Windows world, Java is almost on everything. And we'll go to this chart here. So you have Java in your printers, you have it on your workstations, you have it in your firewalls, your web servers. If you're financial industry, not necessarily applicable here, but even with PCI, if you're point of sale at healthcare organizations, credit card databases or things like that. So what essentially happened was that this Log4j vulnerability ended up being everywhere simply because Java was everywhere. So once the vulnerability was discovered, many organizations quickly realized that they did not have a solid understanding of how widespread this vulnerability was, simply because they did not understand or have inventory on where Java existed within the organization. So that's just another thing, I want to hammer home about just knowing what you have, knowing the versions of software that you have, approved products lists, and knowing where things are on your network. And lastly, what I'll do is I'll leave you with this chart. So this comes from an IBM report a couple of years ago, but it talks about cost savings, cost mitigating factors, and cost amplifying factors. And what we'll focus on is kind of this top left of green. So what we say here, what IBM says rather, excuse me, is that if you perform incident response testing, if you have an incident response team, if you have security awareness training for employees, and if you're often training or your employees through email phishing, these are cost mitigating factors should you be compromised, and we're talking six figures. So incident response testing, you save about $300,000, should you be compromised. And the list goes down as well from, business continuity planning as well as disaster recovery planning. Having cyber insurance, having the board involved or an IT or security kind of steering committee to ensure that IT objectives are in alignment with the business, but also security objectives are in alignment with the business, and everybody that is a stakeholder is involved, has input, and we're all working towards the common goal of risk mitigation within an organization. So, just wanted to leave that there. Data loss prevention also, cost mitigating, especially in the healthcare industry. PHI, EPHI, we want to protect that as much as possible from many ways. So, data at rest, data in motion, data in use. What are our controls in place for there? And do we have sound processes and procedures to ensure that people that need access are getting access, they are trained on the access and the type of sensitive data, and those that don't need access are not getting that access. So I think timing is pretty good here. We have about 5 minutes left. I will open it up for any questions if anybody has anything.
And I'm taking a look at the Q&A channel. It doesn't look like we have any questions at this moment. If anyone does have any questions, please submit them. We're happy to answer those questions now. If nothing comes to you at this moment and you think after today's session, hey, actually, I do have a question, please feel free to reach out to myself or Javier. Javier's contact information is on the screen currently, and we'd be happy to answer those questions at any time. I'm not seeing any questions coming through. Javier, I appreciate your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.